What's going on, guys, and welcome to another episode of Thoughtful Banter. I know it's been a minute, we took a break, but we are back, and we're very excited to have on a guest for today's episode. Quick disclaimer, we had to have this session over Zoom, so we worked on fixing the hiccups here and there, but you might hear some points where the quality of the audio goes down for a bit. We hope it's not too bad to publish and that you guys are still able to get a valuable time from this listen. Hussein and I had the pleasure of having on Sheikh Trenton Carl. He is a graduate of the Ahl Bayt Islamic Seminary, where he studied the core traditional Islamic curriculum and is currently continuing his studies. He worked with several Muslim educational institutions as an editor of the seminary's publication, Al-Sidra, and is the director of the seminary's summer education program, Life. He received a BA in Islamic World Studies from DePaul University. While at DePaul, he was active in several student organizations and served on the board of the UMMA DePaul Muslim Student Organization. After graduating, he worked as a research and teaching assistant in the Islamic World Studies program at DePaul University under Dr. Amina McLeod. Trenton, originally from Houston, now resides in Chicago with his wife. We hope you guys enjoyed this episode, where we get into asking Sheikh Trent how he conducts his new community, which is in Chicago, called Sacred Roots.
Bismillah. What is going on, guys? Welcome to the Thoughtful Banter podcast. It's been a hot minute.
It's been a while, but welcome to season 3. Inshallah, we'd like to start season 3 off with a bang. And we have our respected scholar, Sheikh Trenton Carl, who is Zoom virtually connected with us all the way from Chicago. Thank you so much for being here, Sheikh.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Course. So I guess the reason that we thought Sheikh Trenton would be an interesting person to have on is because recently I've actually had the opportunity of traveling to Chicago and experiencing the Sacred Roots community that he just started. What is it? Over like a little bit over 2 years ago now? Yeah. And so most of their programming had been virtual. In this past year, they've been able to have a physical space, and then they've been able to have in-person programming there for the first time since they've started. And I said that Sacred Roots, my experience at Sacred Roots for the first 10 nights, although I was only able to make it for 5. They had programming for 7. I was able to make it for 5. But I said that it was a life-changing experience. And a lot of people actually in my DMs on the Instagram post, they were like, why was it a life-changing experience? Why was it a life-changing experience? Why? And so now, inshallah, we'll have the opportunity to talk about that. And one of the first things, I guess, that comes to my mind as far as what made it such an interesting experience was that there were things that traditionally are done during Muharram Majalis that you just become used to, right? So of course you have the staples, you have the matam, you have the marsiyas in the beginning, you have the like drum you have the musiva, and you have a lecture, and then you have the food, you go, right? And there obviously every culture has a different way of expressing these, tiny little minute details. There's some differences in the expression of them. So one of the things that I noticed was that there was for example, let me just give an example. There was a large focus on things being in English. And so basically I say all that to give you guys a framework of where I'm coming from and the things that Sacred Roots does that might slightly be different than your traditional masjid. And basically, what I want to start off with in this interview is just jumping straight into is what are the things that Sacred Roots does differently, I guess, to the traditional, what we understand as the traditional like method, not just for Muharram, but in general for having programming in your space. And so what steps as an organization has Sacred Roots done to do that, and why?
Yeah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We're still trying to figure out what we can do differently, but we're not doing it for different sake. I think we want to put that out as the kind of the first step. We're trying to fill gaps. I think that's the way we see ourselves as an organization. Chicago is a rich place for community. There are lots of rather large and long-standing communities here. But we realize that not every person has a community that they slot into well. And so what we have been trying to do as an organization is to make Islam as taught through the Prophet and his family accessible to people outside of the tradition. And that accessibility bit is really one of our main components, so that we want somebody from outside the tradition to be able to walk into the space and kind of get a sense of what's going on, even if it's on the 10th, the night of the 10th, or on Ashura itself, and especially on a day-to-day basis. So figuring out a way to express those teachings in a cultural format that is not strongly alienating to the passerby, that's not strongly alienating to somebody from outside of our madhab, and so on. And it's not only about people outside, quote unquote, of, Imami Shi'ism. It's also about people who don't slot into one of the more traditional spaces, the more long-standing spaces. I think we'll go into this question a little bit later going forward, but not everybody fits into one of the legacy masajid or cultural centers. And insofar as they're looking for something that's has a little less of the strictures of a more formal masjid, because we're not a masjid proper, we try to create that space for that. So definitely accessibility is one. And then two is we're trying to activate knowledge as well. So when you were there from Muharram, one of the things we tried to do is to have community reflections. Now that would be a little bit odd in a traditional space because, like you said, there's kind of a formal process.
Yeah.
Musiba is done. Ya Hussein, Matam, kind of peak emotional, hit, and then you're done. But we wanted to make sure that the lectures, which are passive listening from the audience's perspective, gets to be processed as a community so that we get to speak back about the concepts and themes, and hopefully that helps root those themes inside of us, right? So we actually have a takeaway for ourselves instead of kind of passively listen, got a sense of what he was talking about, then I'm out.
Yeah. So that community reflection, I'm glad that you brought that up. I remember sitting, like the first time I experienced it, sitting down, and I was like, this is weird.
Yeah.
And you can tell everyone else was
strange.
like, kind of like, they were getting warmed up to the idea.
Yeah.
But I like the fact that you guys are willing to like experiment, for lack of a better term, and try different things. And again, not just for different sake, but to catch that demographic that doesn't particularly fit in. Also, another thing I was very surprised about were the amount of converts and Sunnis that were present at the programming every night. So it was beautiful. It was really beautiful to see, and I think that goes to the philosophy that you just laid out for us. Yeah.
Just to add one more thought here that came to my mind. So while maybe when we're thinking about programming, we're thinking about those categories of people. In our experience, we've also noted that people who are very comfortable in traditional spaces and maybe prefer those long-established cultural practices, when they come, they actually enjoy what we're doing as well. So because it's not difference for difference sake, we're not rejecting something else. We're trying to process knowledge a little bit differently. And I think for some people, that pedagogical approach resonates with them in a way that maybe they didn't expect. So it was beautiful to me to see a lot of elders be in the space and, jump right into those conversations.
Yeah.
Because it's really stereotypes. We won't say stereotypes. It's really generalities that we have that like people who are older want something much more traditional. Not always. Or people younger want something non-traditional. You have a lot of younger folks that come into our space, and I've actually heard they're not really into it. They want to go to, the more traditional spaces.
Yeah. I mean, me and Matthew were like I guess we've been raised in these very traditional spaces. Like since we were young, we were always the first little kids in the front of the matam line. So even for me, it was kind of like an interesting experience. I think I actually fall in that category because everything else I've experienced throughout my life has been, go to IEC or go to this masjid.
Right.
It's, to me, the concept is something that gives me a lot of different conflicting emotions, because I feel like growing up, we do like as a kid, you're at the masjid and something happens. It doesn't even need to be negative, but you're just observing what's happening. You're like, why do we do this? Why don't we do this in the masjid? Or why don't we do that? not to be specific because it could be just many different things. And oftentimes the answer we get, unless someone is extremely, I don't want to say extremely traditional, but oftentimes the answer what we get is not that we don't do that thing in the masjid because it's haram. So you're like, okay, if it's not haram, why don't we do it? And the answer is, well, it's just not what we do. It's not the culture.
It's not what has been done.
It's not what has been done.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of fear and anxiety when we move towards this unknown, gray, unstepped in territory of things we haven't done in the masjid before, but we're not even dealing with halal or haram or even like makruh. It's just so intimidating culturally because there is no culture there already made. And so much we have, like when we go into an Ethiopian majority masjid or Iranian majority masjid or Desi majority masjid, these centers all are very different when it comes to like how they culturally set up their culture, like how the culture is set up there. And I just wanted to ask you, how did you find out what to keep and what to, and not to say get rid of, but like, where did you decide to push forward a little bit? Where did you first take those risks for people?
It's a really good question. There's a lot to unpack there. And I think it really gets at the heart of what we're dealing with. To your point, every community, even if they share a culture, expresses, like they share like a box, like ethnic culture, for instance, will express that culture differently.
Yeah.
So you think about a Desi masjid whose kind of religious orientation is like, pro-Iranian Republic, Islamic Republic of Iran, for instance. Mm-hmm. They often express their culture, Desi, South Asian, but they express it through one intellectual track, and it colors what they prioritize in their space and what gets deprioritized and so on. And if you go to a South Asian community who, has more like a Zakir background, like that's kind of the way they express long majalis and lots of matam all night. Like that's a different expression. They're both in the same box, right? In the simple box that we think of, ethnic category and linguistic even, and maybe national. They could both all be Pakistani, for instance, but they express things in different ways. And so even more so, between the Iranian and the South Asian and the Ethiopian and the, Moroccan and so on and so forth. And when you analyze it, when you step back and look at that, you see that there's a spectrum of cultural expression. And so it's actually very natural that we're going to have spaces pop up in the US and Britain and Canada and so on that continue to add to that story, right? So it's not necessarily about rejecting or stripping away. These are easy terms that often I even kind of mistakenly use, like we stripped away this or that, but that's assuming there is some default, right? Instead, my experience is an amalgamation of South Asian culture and Iranian culture, because when I became a Muslim, I was in different types of spaces. So I'm inheriting a bunch of stuff. And then my friends are from different backgrounds. And so the people who are on our team working with Sacred Roots and developing what Sacred Roots is, because it's not about me. Everybody's bringing different bits and pieces to the table. Yeah. And the way we try to choose what we're going to develop, instead of what we're going to leave, what we're going to add, what we're going to develop or nurture, is to try to have a goal, right? And so our goal is to be able to take care of people who maybe don't feel at home in another space. It is to express the teachings of the Prophet and his family through a purely English expression, almost purely English expression, and to develop a cultural aesthetic and a material culture that jives with people in the neighborhood around us, right? Living in Chicago, we're trying to weave in kind of our local Chicago culture, with all of its diversity that goes into that, right? I don't mean white Chicago culture per se. Chicago is a rich cultural space. Weave in bits of that because we live here and it influences us too. And so we want to bring that into our space instead of seeing that as something alien. but being educationally focused so that the educational goals and the community goals, relationship goals is what we drive toward. And then we sprinkle in bits and pieces from these other expressions, and we recognize what things might be off-putting to somebody who's new to the space.
So I have a question as far as like, how do you guys differentiate yourself? And I'll make this question make a little bit more sense after I explain it. But stereotypically, a lot of elders, for example, again, stereotypically, this is not necessarily the case, but stereotypically, people think that elders will reject some of this more modern or, push towards English. Some people cite that it's because you're becoming more like Americans. You're becoming more liberal in your ideologies, and you're moving away from like what the essence of Islam is. Obviously, that comes from a place of ignorance. But for you guys, how do you guys make sure that you're not? How do you guys differentiate? How do you guys try to differentiate yourselves from those groups that do that, and have kind of like some of the same approaches that you do? So a lot of stuff will be in English. They'll get like non-traditional scholars to come and speak at their event and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think it's through intentionality, right? So some folks, and it is a reality. Some groups who see that there's something wrong and they try to patch it, and they think like a more quote unquote Western sensibility or modern sensibility. Modern is often the term.
Modern, yeah, exactly.
Will like somehow solve the issues. Sometimes it's more reactive. It's a reaction to a feeling of loss or a feeling of some sort of problem, and that reaction is not always fully fleshed out. So yeah, it's kind of like if you're at a space, you're in a very small, like a smaller tradition, like very culturally traditional space, which is good. And then they realize, oh, like our kids don't get this. Like they don't pay attention because maybe they don't know the language, maybe X, Y, and Z. So their reaction sometimes is, we just need somebody to do something in English. Like anybody say something in English. And then it's kind of subpar, or it's not, especially you're talking to kids, it's hard to keep kids' attention.
Yeah.
And so the pedagogy isn't there, like the skill to actually educate isn't there, though it is in English. So it's a bad reaction. So I think that's what we're seeing in some spaces in regards to like modern tradition. Like it's like a rejection. It's a rejective reaction. So we try to be intentional. Like, again, even me as like, half white, half Mexican guy who like became Muslim, like I've been nourished by these traditional cultures. They've brought many things to my life that I wouldn't have had access to if I had not been open to it, and had they not been open to receiving me to a certain extent. But I understand that for some people, that's a hard gap to clear. Yeah. And even from people who are more Pakistani than me, who are like born and raised Pakistani, they might reject it quicker than I would. So like these categories are often not like the active categories in thinking about how one identifies. Just because you're Pakistani doesn't mean you act in this type of way or you have this type of aesthetic culture, right? So what we're trying to do is intentionally identify what those gaps might be, or where those gaps might be too far, or where they may not, those approaches to religion may not jive in general culture, and then find ways to translate those methods in a new way where you're still achieving the same ends, right? We'll use Muharram just because it's right here and like we just got out of it, and it's just like a clear illustration, right? Majalis are about remembering Imam Hussein and transforming your soul to jive with what he was all about. Yeah. All right. So Urdu Majlis for an English speaker, that just won't work. I don't know Urdu. It might work somehow aesthetically. I could go there and I could cry because I kind of know the story roughly, and there's emotion and power in that form of Majlis. But at some point there's a ceiling. Yeah. And so taking the goal of that Majlis and then reworking it toward the same end, but in a different way, is what keeps you from reacting and rejecting too much and thinking that something new is what you're after. Because sometimes that new thing may not have the same goal as that traditional thing. So we see ourselves tethering ourselves to those same aims insofar as traditional cultures are Quranically rooted. We have the same goals, we have the same aims, but we might just chart a different path to get there.
That was
wow.
When you look at it from that perspective, like everything, like if you think of this as like the main goal, all of these centers are actually rooted and branching off of this goal.
Yeah.
Following the path of God as taught to his prophet through the Ahlul Bayt after him. We're all connected and tethered to that same goal. So that's our unity bit. But we're all expressing it in different ways. Yeah. Once you begin to think of it as, I don't like what they're doing at all, so I need to create something totally new, you probably missed this bit. This connectivity back to God, that vertical bit.
Dude, I mean,
sometimes there is a rupture in that connection, right? Maybe it's crooked or something. That's fine. Leave it. Like you can let them reform it, whatever, but don't reject it altogether, because then you create a different goal that might be subpar, in my mind anyway.
That's just that just deserves a subhanallah, because it leads me to think, it feels like we have these rich, old, like over 1,000-year-old cultures, from all around the world, and like you said, like that goal is, connection to Allah. And I guess the cultures are the culture is our way of understanding that connection, to make it relatable to us. It is to make it desirable to us, right? Through, I guess, cultures, a combination of many different things, it's subjective to like what's around us. So it's using our understanding of the world around us to maybe get connected to that source. But it feels like somewhere along the way, and this isn't to harp on culture, like culture is bad, but I guess people make mistakes. And it feels like so much of our spaces, people really get bogged down in, like, I guess tribalism is a word. Because like when we start distincting, like, oh, my culture, like, if I'm Iranian, I go to an Afghan masjid, for example, I'm like, oh, these people aren't doing matam right. They're lost. Like I've heard people say stuff like that, like, oh, why are these Afghans doing the Sinazani like this? They're lost, bro. And it's like, it's not how it works, That's just so funny, because it's like, it really puts it in perspective. I think that's something a lot of us forget a lot, what the main goal is.
And it actually, that type of reaction indicates it's not just like an asabiyya. It's not just like a tribal superiority or an ethnic superiority or something like that. It's actually, it's probably partially that, but it's actually a view of the world that's very shallow, because then you've identified the shell, right? Like the form of matam, right? You've identified the form and conflated it with the meaning or the goal. And so you look at somebody else's matam and you're like, just because their form differs, it's wrong. That's a shallow and very superficial understanding of the world. If their matam, say, has problematic meanings in it, or they prioritize meanings that are incorrect or something, then you can criticize that. But now it's not about the form. It's about what's the meaning of the know-how that they prioritize. So depth of vision is actually what's key to understanding community building in the US. It's like being able to separate form from meaning. And that's often very difficult because they're meant to be intertwined. It's actually the power of culture, is that meaning intertwines with forms of expression.
Wow.
But when they get ossified, they get stuck, and we can't untie them. Then we become unflexible and we can't react to new issues in our material circumstance. Living in Chicago, the issues that I deal with are different than living in, Portland, Oregon, for instance. So my culture here operates a little bit differently because my material surroundings are different. than if I were to live in Portland, Oregon, much less, Tehran or Karachi or something like that.
Wow. Beautiful answer. Anyways, just to change gears a little bit. I know we've been talking a lot, basically about your philosophy, how you do things differently. The philosophy, even behind doing those things differently, is not different for different sake. I mentioned earlier about the crowd of people that was there. So like you said, you had elders, you had some young people that, go to the other masajid in the area that I guess you consider more traditional. You have people who don't fit that mold, and you had a lot of converts and you had a lot of Sunnis. So I know when I stepped into your space, as far as the experience that I saw other converts having, and I spoke to about these experiences, it seemed like they experienced something in Sacred Roots that they didn't experience elsewhere. I know you yourself are a convert, so this is probably something you've put a lot of thought into. But how do you think, or why do you think that exists, or that is the case?
That it's easy for people to come in?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think human experience.
Because I asked that question though, just to give you I guess some more background.
Sure.
In traditional centers, there is English programming, right?
Yes.
there's plenty of English programming. You can walk into a Friday Jum'ah and the lecture will be the khutbah would be in English.
Yeah.
So it's not like those things aren't there. I mean, maybe some of them aren't, but for the most part, you can find a lot of what you find at Sacred Roots at another masjid.
Right.
So what do you think is the difference?
Yeah, I think simple things like, in my experience, most community spaces kind of assume that there's a certain population that's coming in and out. So there's no need to welcome somebody when they come in. Because it's just like, you're not going to come in if you're not from outside. So it's just not part of the program to even think about having somebody at the door to say, hello, salam, welcome. This is what we're all about. So simple things like that. I come out of the church experience, raised Christian. You walk into a church, they give you a pamphlet. I mean, it's been a long time. It's probably digital now. I'm probably not handing out paper pamphlets anymore. But it's the program for the morning, contacts of who's who in the church, how to contact the pastor. Here's who to call if you want to be a member of the community, so on and so forth. You have a whole thing. And somebody's handing it to you, saying, good morning, welcome to the Sunday service. Oh, you need to drop your kids off at the nursery. Oh, you have Sunday school. It's a human experience, right? So our space, one of the purposes of our space is to facilitate people coming from outside in to learn. The goal is the learning part and the community part and the spiritual experience part. To facilitate that, you have to make somebody feel comfortable and welcome. You have to make them feel like they're at home. And so it's just about having the right people in the space who are warm characters, who have good akhlaq, good, personal virtue and character to welcome someone in and introduce them and swap a number and so on and so forth. It's just being human,
I think I picked up more numbers than I've ever picked up in my life. At Sacred Roots, in one place. But that's a good point you bring up, because I mean, one of the first things that I say when I walk into somewhere new, Matty, I'm sure, can relate to this as well, because even though he's half Iranian, he looks very, very white. When you walk into the space, does anyone greet you? Does anyone check for you?
Yeah.
I've never been here in my life. This is my first time walking in. Black guy with dreads and earrings. Oh,
Yeah.
Is anyone going to say anything? So like a lot of times when I talk to my friends who are from Desi backgrounds who maybe haven't experienced this, they'll say things like, "Oh, this center is amazing." I was like, I don't really care too much for that center. They're like, "Oh, why? But the program's this, the program's this. They have these colors, they have these colors." And I was like, "Yeah, all that's amazing." I walk in there, no one speaks to me. Not a single person opens their mouth. You know? They'll look at you. They'll be like, they notice you.
Yeah.
But they won't say anything to you.
Yeah.
So I think that like just that by itself automatically allows for much more people, much more like different types of people even to be welcomed and feel comfortable in this space.
I just gotta say, like, it's honestly like it's kind of morbidly depressing how simple that is. Like, we're really talking about, like, I mean, and I haven't got the pleasure to go yet, but when Hussein came back from Sacred Roots, I'm not kidding, he couldn't stop talking about it. Like, he was like, this is a nice bougie masjid space, bro. Like, it looks clean, minimalistic, not bougie in a bad way. It's like, it's just very clean. It's very different than like your typical masjid space. Like, even everything from like the architecture to like the food, like everything was good. It's a great experience. And it's just so unfortunate that people forget, like, a community is a community because of people first.
Yep.
Like that aspect of, like, I mean, we know, like, in hadith, right? Like, when, like, the early, like the first years of Islam, when people would convert, Prophet Muhammad would literally assign people who had already been Muslim. He would assign them to new converts. And he'd be like, hey, take care of this guy, show him everything, you know, like, just make sure his life is good before you even start really like teaching him Islam and all that. Just take care of him. That's your boy, you know, like, essentially, like, that's your boy. And it seems like that's what Sacred Roots is doing. Like, that experience of being in a masjid and everyone looking at you, but knowing no one's saying salam is like, it's just such a sad experience. Like, no masjid should be like that. You know, that's crazy.
What would you say to people? Because I've heard this, like, as a, I guess, response to some of the things that I've been saying, who are like, well, one, converts make up like a small portion of any community, right? Like, just even of Muslims, I guess Shia Muslims, converts are not a very big population or demographic. So maybe, and not only that, but also converts give up. So like, you'll put a lot of like energy and time into making this person feel welcome, and then they'll just stop coming. And then, yeah. So what do you say? I mean, I have some thoughts of my own about that, but what do you say to people who might bring these kind of, objections up?
So I want to circle back real quick to Mehdi's point, then I'll hit that.
Okay.
The good news, and this will be 2 seconds. The good news is about the fact that it's just a human experience. Like, people would just saying salam to you as you come into a space. The good news is, if you just changed that simple thing in every community center, you'd have a much richer, in my mind, I think you'd have a much richer Muslim polity across the US.
Yeah.
So it's not like Sacred Roots is like revolutionary in this. It's just like saying, hey, salam, man, like, welcome.
What's up,
come on in, sister. Like, feel comfortable here. And like, we're your family.
Yeah.
You know, like, all believers are brothers and sisters, you know?
Yeah.
So it's not like something profound. It's profound, but it's so simple and it's so human. On the convert bit, converts are a tiny portion, in particular, of the Shi'i community, partially because we don't have institutional frameworks for them to come in larger numbers. And they give up partially because we don't have the institutional infrastructure for them to stick around. If a new convert comes in and nobody's saying salam to them, why would they come back? It's as simple as that.
Why? Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so many other problems. Like, we really don't have much good literature or media, pamphlets, books, websites. Like, we don't have the infrastructure to bring in larger numbers of people. And so that's a failing on our part. So, you can't start by saying, well, there's so few of them, why cater to them? You have to ask, well, why are there so few?
Why are there so few of them? Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of like a lopsided view to a lopsided way to even view the whole situation. I mean, just off the top of my head, Islam is like the fastest growing religion. And I think that's the only reason why our numbers are up, because I think across the board, like, there's never been, I think last time I checked, I was just reading this. I don't know how accurate it is, but I believe that, Christianity, Islam, Judaism is like losing followers. The only reason Islam's numbers are keeping up is because our conversion rate is really high.
That, and they're the kids too.
Yeah.
People born into it.
Yeah. Muslims are having a lot more kids, and conversion rates are really high, and that's, I think, like, we got to like look at converts as like the saving grace of Islam. If you really think about it, if we're losing Muslims, especially if if we're losing Muslims mostly from countries or mostly from people with ethnic backgrounds who they've always been Muslim, then we have to look at the way we're viewing Islam, or the way we have been viewing Islam needs some change. Because why are people leaving? You know?
I was just going to say, I think the last numbers I saw on the demographics of the US Muslim community, I think the study was like 2017, so it's a little bit old. But it was saying that converts make up about a quarter of the Muslim population in the US, but about 25% of born Muslims leave the community as well.
That's a lot.
So the Muslim community is at kind of a stasis.
Yeah, it's like stuck. Basically, I started interacting more with them because my mother-in-law, she does a lot of work with them as far as like education and stuff like that. She's probably one of the only people doing that or making an effort to do that. But one thing that I noticed is that they're all like within themselves. Like they all just hang out with each other. There's really, it's really this group of converts. And then we go to this center, but we're not a part of that center's community. We just attend their programming because this is Islamic programming that we otherwise wouldn't have access to. And I had a bigger point after that.
I can add something if you're trying to think of it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I just want to say, dude, like, it's a very obvious point, but I'm just thinking like, dude, being Muslim is actually like fairly difficult. You know, like it's difficult for anybody. And I just can't imagine, like, especially for a convert, dude, the only thing really, like, I wouldn't say the only thing, but I think one of the biggest things that holds us to our faith is each other. You know, as a community, we know Islam is a very social religion. Like in Islamic, let's not even talk about culture. Like within Islamic practices, Islam basically tells you, be with people, don't be by yourself, you know, be amongst other Muslims, like work together. That's like in the core of the religion. Like we believe if you're praying, if you have to choose between praying by yourself and feeling extra spiritual and doing a long salat and you read Quran with beautiful soul, or you have to pray in some packed masjid with a bunch of other smelly dudes shoulder to shoulder, you should pray like in a larger group of people, even though it kind of sucks sometimes, you know, like you lose your torba, there's kids running around, the dude next to you needs to wear some extra deodorant, you know, but you get more blessings from that larger communion.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I just want to jump in real quick. One of the things that Sheikh Trent throughout his like lecturing, he kept on quoting this ayah of the Quran, وَأَتَسِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا, which is like hold on to the rope of God together. And so that just beautifully speaks to the point that you're just making. Like we're in this together.
Yeah.
Like literally, we're a family. And we're in this together. So we all need to go. If the boat is like rocking really hard one way, we all need to rock really hard that way.
Yeah, and I think like at least, and I'm not a convert, so I don't mean to be overstepping on your experience, Sheikh Trent, but I just from my own outside opinion, what I see, like just from the perspective of people who see people coming in to the religion, I feel like the way we deal with converts is we make it nice for them to join Islam, but once they're in, I think that's where like it becomes really difficult for them. Like that's where they don't have as much support. Like we do all we can to make Islam be like, it's like we're car salesmen, you know, we're trying to sell this car and like we make sure it's polished and it's glistening and it's beautiful for them. And when they're in,
once they're off the lot,
that joint loses $3,000 in value and they come back like, hey, my tire's broken. You know, well, yeah, that's not my problem. You know, it's like, deal with it.
That was actually the point I was going to make.
Okay,
I was talking about the convert community. That's exactly the point. Like we get them to a point.
Yeah.
Like we get them till they say their shahada. And then after that, it's like, all right, you got this, bro.
Yeah. Yeah.
You got this.
They left high and dry.
Yeah, definitely. Because you mentioned framework. And so I guess to bring this back to more practical like applications of how a community could take some of these ideas and implement them. So you mentioned, you know, just greeting people at the door. Like that's something that's super simple, super easy. But you also mentioned we don't have the infrastructure in place to maintain and sustain this large convert community that often gets developed around these community centers, right? So what steps would a center take? So I want to ask you two questions. One, what steps are you guys taking to do that as someone who's basically has you're like setting the groundwork for a lot of this stuff. Right. And there's really no blueprint for you to follow. So what steps are you guys making? And second, for a center who's already kind of had an established way of being, what steps would you recommend they take to kind of change that?
So I want to first acknowledge that, well, there may not be an infrastructural blueprint in terms of, in particular, Shia communities for how we should go about this. I think I was immensely blessed in my first years of being Muslim to be around people that showed me this way of thinking. Two individuals in particular, I won't name names, but they really took me under their wing. One brother noticed that I would hang out at the masjid from after Jumrah to the evening because it was like a youth program in the evening. I was like 19. And I couldn't drive 45 minutes from my home 4 times a day. So I would stay there all day. And he began just like, I live across the street in the apartments across the street. Like, let's have lunch, and having my first meal on the floor, eating with my hands and like those experiences. And then I was always at his house after that. And he became a mentor for me. Or like the older Iranian brother who, within a few months of in the community, and spending time with me and bringing me into his home, he made a copy of a key to his home and gave it to me and said, if you ever need a place to stay, if you ever need to drop by, you can just walk on in. Here's a key to my house. That changed the way I saw it. There's a spiritual blueprint that I was blessed to have experienced in my first days. Institutionally, I think that I try to draw from those same experiences and just try to see how can you translate those experiences at the level of a community, right? Like more broadly. I'm not saying everybody should be giving people keys to their homes, but maybe the space becomes the home. It's that temporary home that people are coming into, and then building relationships that extend beyond those 4 walls, right? So one key component that we try to keep in mind as ethos is that our space is not the end. The space is a means toward an end. And that ends is for all of these people to create relationships that extend into their homes, into the city, into restaurants, into coffee shops. That's what a community ultimately is. Sneak peek, another institutional bit. I haven't announced this. I'm still working on it. Inshallah, toward the end, we are hoping to host a convert-centric conference, hopefully next spring. I was just saying, like, it's a little bit odd to me that there are no convert-focused conferences. If we're concerned about that issue, and it is kind of a specialized issue, then we need to create spaces for them. In conferences, sometimes there's like an hour for like convert discussion or something. It's all good. But it's probably not quite enough. Yeah.
So you're going to continue? Sorry.
I was just going to say, I mean, we have many more plans for like media production and so on and so forth, but it's just going to take a lot of manpower and funding. I mean, funding is always an issue for these types of projects.
So another thing that you mentioned in your series, this Muharram, was you talked a lot about incentive structures and like Islamic incentive structures. And part of my degree is like, I had to take a lot of economics class as part of my degree. So like, whenever you start talking about incentive structures, that automatically perks my ear up, So I guess my question is in relation to incentive structures, what kind of incentive structures need to be there or need to change, or how should we think about things differently to prioritize making our convert brothers feel like they're actually our brothers rather than trophies that we put on the wall and then, applaud ourselves for?
I think there's like, if you will, like a religious answer. And then there's like an experience answer. So the religious answer is that we should begin to expand our conceptions of what religiosity is by including human interactions. So Imam Jafar, alayhi salam, for instance, I'm paraphrasing here, has a hadith where he says one of the most beloved acts of God is to bring surur to a believer, to bring happiness to a believer. And then he continues with 3 examples of how one could do that: to take care of one's hunger, to pay off one's debt, and to more or less be a shoulder to lean on when one is anxious or depressed and so on. So the idea that bringing happiness to a believer, and a convert is now a believer, is one of the most beloved acts to God. That's the religious answer. You want to get good with God? Help other people get good with God.
That's your incentive.
That's your incentive. And so that's like here's the text here, figure it out kind of thing. But the experience answer is that if we approach new Muslims with the anticipation that they're going to be a burden on our lives because we have to help them, then what we're keeping out of our frame of view is that this person could become a good friend to me. They could be of benefit to me. They could enrich my life. They could, you know what I'm saying? Like they can be a friend. So like, that's like the more human answer, which is...
Don't assume that they have nothing to offer.
Yeah, exactly. And yes, discomfort will come with that because it's stretching you, especially if they don't jive. Like if you're coming from 2 different cultural backgrounds or something like that, it does require us to expand ourselves. And they're going to have questions that maybe we don't have answers to, and so on and so forth. But if you see it as like a human connection with another believer, which again, innamal mu'minuna ikhwa, brothers and believers are brethren, you have the kind of command, if you will, the religious push, but you also have the experience of I have a new friend, or so many possible ways that person can enrich your life as well.
Yeah, and the reality is that building relationships with anyone, even from the same culture, requires an amount of discomfort. It requires an amount of vulnerability. That's not that most people don't actively look for.
Yeah. So I mean, I think
absolutely.
we just gotta break out of that. I mean, I think this part of this is like a cultural thing, and a lot of it is also just like a classic human error. We want to be comfortable, but no growth comes whenever you're just being comfortable, and obviously I think we do just maybe need to recontextualize the situation to bring more incentive, like thinking, hey, converts are our future. And then maybe also like, and that's maybe a practical way of looking at it. And also like an Islamic point of view is like, hey bro, you sin? Yeah. You scared of your sins? You want to go to heaven? All right, let's help out a few more converts, like the practical, and the spiritual side.
Yeah.
So I think this is going to be my last question, because this can go on for long, but this is kind of a way, this is outside of necessarily what you're doing with Sacred Roots or even the conversation that we've been having. But in this, in this discussion of incentive structures and incentives and stuff like that, you also mentioned reframing or trying to kind of taking a moment to reanalyze how we understand religiosity. And so maybe this is just like the Q&A for a scholar section, because you started saying some things in Chicago that were really interesting. And I kind of just want you to, if you're able to, just build a little bit on that. Like, what do you mean? What would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sociological reasons, or reasons we can analyze sociologically, rather, a lot of our communities have been built as protections, right? So that, this issue of comfort that you're talking about, it's because you have migrant communities who they need their own space to feel comfortable, because they're in a new civilization where they feel discomfort.
Mhm.
And so in a way, that's actually really good. And maybe in a way, we should maintain that. Right? So this whole discussion about like abandoning culture altogether, this is that benefit that comes in keeping a tradition, especially as a minority in larger civilization. But with that said, now you have people like yourselves, like you young folks, who you don't feel that disconnection per se. There's no longing for a land that you used to live in, because this is the land that you live in. So the types of messaging that are more inspiring to that type of person is a building focus. It's a development, a nourishing focus. That is, take values of your religion and then build infrastructure, culture, material culture in particular, that jives with or comes out of those religious values, and then allows you to navigate the material reality that you live in, your city or whatever, in a way that feels more in line with those values. So the development of religious art and arts of various forms. This is a simple example that I like to give because I love breakfast. I went a Muslim diner in Chicago, not just another halal restaurant, but the experience of grabbing breakfast with your family at a diner. That's like a very American experience that I relate to, at least, and I think a lot of others relate to. And I'd love to be able to go there without worrying about what bacon touched my pancakes or whatever, and have a halal menu and so on. That sounds like I just want to eat something. No, I'm trying to create the Muslim civilizational infrastructure in my space. We always talk about the past, about how Muslim civilization was beautiful and complex, and there was art, and there was hospitals, and there was food, and there was culture, right? It's all this culture that we're trying to hold on to from back there. Awesome. Now we need to keep building it here. Like, history didn't stop. We're building history. We're living history. So I think that that's part of religious impetus. It's to change your material surroundings in line with your values. So it's not just about praying and fasting. It's not just about revolution and like seeking justice. Those are all true. But it's also about creating things that make us feel happy according to our religious values. And I think that type of incentive structure then gets people who are into business, into food, into investment, into all of that comes together, medicine, and so on. All these things, these latent powers that are in our Muslim community because we're an educated community and so on and so forth, can now come together. Y'all are too young probably, but it's like Captain Planet. Like, everybody has a special power and then they summon this great like superhero. Everybody comes together with their latent powers and builds a space that kind of resonates Islam into the city itself.
Yeah. Amazing point. And it reminds me of something that Sayed talks about a lot. And he talks about, a lot of people have this strict, rigid understanding of what religiosity is. I go to the masjid, I pray, I do my salatul layl. I wake up in the middle of the night, do salatul layl. Then I say, I do salatul fajr. Like, this very rigid understanding of what religiosity is. And then what he says is like, for example, if you were to go to war, like a Islamic war, if you were to go to war and you came back crippled and with PTSD, like, you were being religious while you did that. If you're at home and, you're crazy juggling between your kids and, giving time to your wife and stuff like that, you're acting out that spirituality. You're acting out that religiosity right there in your job, providing for your family. Like, these are things you're doing and you are being religious. So I think it's very good for reminder for people not to get locked into a specific conception of, or a traditional conception of what religiosity or spirituality looks like.
It's just like I don't know. I got goosebumps. Like, what you're talking about was just like so inspirational, and I think I can see like why Sacred Roots, alhamdulillah, is so successful, and inshallah, you guys get like even more and more and more success, because like you hit the nail on the head when you're talking like what this generation wants. Like we do want to build, we see the potential, like we want to do all this stuff. And like, yeah, you just really hit the nail on the head with that one. Like I think I saw something on, I don't frequent Reddit, but I occasionally glance at it. And I saw something on Muslim Reddit. Someone asked the question, how much do you think culture has influenced Islam? And it was so many comments saying, not at all. There's no culture in Islam. And I'm just thinking how delusional people are like about our own culture. Like, I just think, I mean, I'm happy. What you're saying is make me happy, but I also, I'm sad that so many people are missing out on this perspective, because I think it can be really useful to people. I think people have only one perception. I think a lot of Muslims have only one perception of Islam, and they're unwilling to change the perception of what Islam is. I don't just mean like, boomer generation people. I mean like our like my generation. I think a lot of people who are trying to hold on to the religion have only one perspective, and they can't change, or not that they can't, but they won't change their perception on it. And that very perception of the religion is what's making it harder for them to hold on to it. Like they're making it hot like a coal in their hand, but they want to hold on to that coal, so it's burning them. And I'm just like, dude, if you could just put your hand in some water while holding on to that coal, like it could cool off. Like you could hold it, like you could just, I don't know, like how, I don't know even if this is a question, but I just want people to be able to maybe, if someone's listening to this, or if anyone here has anyone to say about that, like I want my fellow Muslim brothers and sisters to just be able to like relax for a second and just open up their mind to like what could be,
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes 100%.
Sense. And it's a, excuse me, it's a self-inflicted wound to some extent. Like you said, is like, we need to open our minds, but we should also be wary that form of thinking is exactly what the secular project wants us to think. It's self-inflicted, but it's also messaging that we're getting from outside that we need to be on guard of, and realize that we can fix that, right? Sometimes if you have like a perceived enemy, it actually inspires you to move forward with a little more verve. Mm-hmm. And so we should be aware of that as well.
Yeah, definitely. The created lines between, what is it? Like, I don't remember the language specifically, but I know what you're talking about. I know what you're referring to. Your religiosity is for your spaces of worship, and that's for your house. And then anything else, keep that there. Yeah. The practicality of which is not super, super high or reasonable. And obviously it's not something we should.
Totally.
Thank you so much, Sheikh Trent, for joining us on, this podcast. We really appreciate it. Inshallah, we hope to have you on in the future. Before we let you go, however, I do want to know, how should people get in touch with you and your organization?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you guys for having me, and thanks for doing this podcast. We need more people breaking into new spaces like this, tinkering, experimenting. So tawfiq with the continuation of it, inshallah. You can find us at sacredrootscommunity.org. We have a calendar of events on our website, and we do have programs in person here in Chicago. And we also have programs that we run virtually via Zoom and through Instagram Live. So if you're not in Chicago, you can still be in touch with us. You can also find us on Instagram, instagram.com/sacredrootscommunity, Facebook for those who still use Facebook. And you can contact me at Trenton, that's TRENTON, at sacredrootscommunity.org. It's my email, and we can be in touch that way. And of course, if you're in Chicago, look at our calendar of events, drop by.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sheikh.
Thank you so much.